Welcome to Old Testament 101. And this lesson is on the books of Ezekiel and Daniel. And so we will do an overview of these two books. So we'll turn to our study guide right now. So we first look at the book of Ezekiel, and Ezekiel tells about the ministry of Ezekiel the prophet. And Ezekiel was he was in the first group of Jewish exiles in Babylon. And so this is different than Jeremiah, who, if you remember in our study in our last lesson, Jeremiah primarily did his ministry from Jerusalem. And so Ezekiel will primarily do, he'll do all of his ministry as far as Babylon. He was carried away into Babylon. And so that becomes his place of ministry. The book is named Ezekiel because of the prophet Ezekiel. And his name means God strengthens, which is really a good name when you think about it, as far as when you're in captivity. You need a God that will strengthen you and help you through this time. So the book of Ezekiel identifies its author as Ezekiel. We've said that, and tradition and most scholars seem to agree on that. Ezekiel was written between the dates of Ezekiel's first vision, somewhere maybe 593 to 592 BC, and his last recorded vision somewhere around 570 to 71. This book is easily dated because Ezekiel was careful to include the dates of his vision as he wrote, and the book of Ezekiel was probably finished shortly at 570. The purpose of Ezekiel is to remind the exiles in Babylon that the God of the covenant had not forgotten them, and even though they were far away from the temple and the promised land. The theme of Ezekiel says that the purpose of God's grace and discipline is always to produce spiritual restoration in all the people. So in this book, this is given a special notice with the phrase, "They shall know that I am Lord." And so the structure of Ezekiel is roughly the same as the book of Jeremiah. And so begins, the first three chapters begins with his call as a prophet. And then Ezekiel's first major section contains prophecies of judgment against Judah. And remember now that he is giving these prophecies from Babylon. Ezekiel's second section tells about God's judgment on the nations of the world. And so again, very similar to Jeremiah, focusing first on judgment upon God's people, but then also judgment on those nations around the world, which is reminds us that God is a God of the whole world, and he's always concerned about what people do. Back in the ancient times, even though Egypt was not called to a special purpose like Israel was, certainly God loved and cared for the Egyptians as well, and would judge them for the ways that they acted. And then the third major section in Ezekiel is of restoration of Judah. And I find that in Ezekiel, especially when you get into chapters 37, 38, and following, these are some powerful descriptions of God's restoration. And there's the valley of dry bones. And, if you think about it, the people of Israel, the nation of Judah has been carried off into captivity, and they feel depleted, they feel dead, and God brings life into these dry bones, and that they gain flesh, and then he goes on to talk about them being ruled by a king and a Lord, and certainly those passages certainly deal with the resurrection to come, And it's a fascinating passage, which is the hope of Christians. Our hope is not that one day we will go to heaven, but that we one day will resurrect. And so regardless of what's going on in our lives, God will bring resurrection to us. And so if you notice that it seems like every Old Testament book that we go into, even though there's judgment, even though there are problems and trouble, God always continues to come back to this theme that he's going to restore his people and he's going to keep his promise. And remember, the promise goes back to Genesis 12, where God promised Abraham and his descendants that God was going to bless the nations of the world. And God is going to continue through this promise regardless of the sin of people. And so Ezekiel, historical background, we've said it, his ministry is based in Babylon, where he was in exile. And then we've given the dates of prophecy, 592 to 570. Jerusalem fell in 586 BC, and so Ezekiel's message told about the coming judgment on Judah because of its sin. And after Jerusalem fell, Ezekiel's message told about the future restoration of Jerusalem, which we talked about. And the book is what makes Ezekiel so fascinating is the way that many times he will talk about God's word and the things that God does, and he uses very visual things, laying on his side, being tied, things like that for a year. A very fascinating book. Ezekiel was alive at the same time as Jeremiah and Daniel. Again, Jeremiah is prophesying in Jerusalem, whereas Daniel, he is carried off during the exile. We'll talk about that in a few moments here. So the message of Ezekiel follows its structure. Judah would fall because of her disobedience to God. And so that's the first major section of the book of Ezekiel. The nations of the world then would be judged. That's the second section of the book. And then again, God is going to be faithful to his covenant promises. Ezekiel tells, now as we talk about the theology, Ezekiel tells about God's glory and character, and his ministry begins with visions that demonstrated God's majesty and greatness, and he often spoke about God's glory then in the rest of the book. And Ezekiel is always continually trying to bring people back to God. So in preaching, how would you preach the book of Ezekiel? Ezekiel shows that God cares about his people no matter where they're at. So whether they are in Jerusalem or whether they've been carried off as exiles hundreds of miles away from home, that God cares, and that God has not forgotten them. And also the book of Ezekiel gives us ways that we might live when we are, in some sense, we are in the countries that we live in are still in exile. We have not received the new heavens and the new earth that God promises in his word. And so these are just some different things that you could preach. I think you could especially focus on the chapters of restoration and renewal, especially the section with the dry bones and receiving life and the resurrection, and then also the prophetic visions towards a coming kingdom and a king that would rule, and that just fits Jesus and what he's doing. So this is just an outline of the book, and I just highlighted here in our notes Israel being restored, and again, that seems to be a theme in each one of the books. Let's go ahead and move to Daniel. The book of Daniel tells the story of Daniel, a Jewish exile who became a court official in Babylon. And Daniel served as a close advisor to both the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and to Cyrus, the Persian king who had conquered Babylon. So the book of Daniel is named for Daniel. He's the main character of the book. And the name Daniel is God is my judge. A lot of fascinating stories, and we'll talk about that in a moment in the book of Daniel. So the book of Daniel just names Daniel as the author, and many would agree. Daniel was written traditionally. People think that Daniel was written somewhere around 530 BC. There are other scholars that think that Daniel was even written a lot later, into the 2nd and 3rd century. But for now, we will focus on the 530 date here. The purpose of Daniel is to show how God works out his purposes even in a foreign land. And Daniel is carried away into captivity. And one of the things that the Babylonians would do, especially when they began to take people out of Jerusalem, they would take educated people. They would take those that could serve the Babylonian kingdom. And so if you remember the story, God takes Daniel and then Daniel's 3 friends, and they become kind of a big part of the story. And there's just a lot of neat stories that happen in there. The themes in Daniel are God's faithfulness to his covenant, even when his people were in exile, and then also God's authority over all nations. And there's some powerful stuff that Daniel gives some prophecies about kingdoms that will come, and he gives those to the Babylonian and the Persian kings, and those prophecies are ones that the church has held on to, and so again, some very good things there to focus on. Daniel is structured around the theme of God's authority over all nations, which is shown in 2 stages. The first stage tells about the future of the Gentile world powers, and so chapters 2 through 7, we see that, and those are introduced through some dreams and visions. The second stage tells about the future of the Jewish nation under the power of the Gentiles. And again, a lot of these books, the Jewish people during Jesus's time had anticipated coming out of captivity, and they had focused a lot on Daniel. We get the phrase "Son of Man" from the book of Daniel, and so again, we see the reference to that with Jesus. So historical background, Daniel's ministry took place 605 to 536 BC, and Daniel, again, was from a noble Jewish family. As a youth, Daniel was taken from Jerusalem to Babylon in the first captivity. Once there, Daniel became a trusted advisor to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who ruled from 605 to 562. And then Persia conquered Babylon in 539, and Daniel, once again, becomes a prominent advisor to the foreign king, gaining favor with the Persians, and the Persian king Cyrus decreed in 538 that the Jews in exile could return to Jerusalem and build the temple and city there. So it's during that time that we see Daniel and his faithfulness. We see some stories of he and his young friends who refused to eat the king's food, and God uses that. We see the stories of them being called to bow down to idols, and they refused to do that as well. And then there's the story of Daniel being thrown in the lion's den, and God's protection over that. So the development and the message of the book of Daniel develops in 2 ways. One way, it tells about the prophetic plans for the Gentiles, chapters 2 through 7, and then narrows its focus to Israel in the prophecies 8 through 12. The second way shows how God protects those who keep his covenant without compromise. The book of Daniel shows that God is the ruler of all nations. And so even though Babylon is a very powerful nation, and then Persia comes in to conquer Babylon, in the book of Daniel, we realize and recognize that nothing happens or is allowed to happen without God's hand on it, that the God of Daniel is the true God and who rules. And so the events in every nation, both present and future, serve his purpose. The events surrounding Daniel, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their uncompromising obedience within Babylon serve to show God's faithfulness to those who are faithful to him. And so Daniel's a lot of prophecy, and the way I read those texts is that God is focused on the different kingdoms that will rise up from the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medes. We have the Greek states then, and then the Roman Empire, and now God allows these empires, but there will be one who will crush them all. And that ultimately, I think, leads to Jesus and the kingdom that he sets up. The book of Daniel, how do you preach this book? Well, first of all, the book of Daniel has some great stories in it about showing obedience and faith. You know, Daniel would not stop praying to his God, and he even willing to go to a lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were uncompromising in their faith. They would not bow down to the idol of Nebuchadnezzar, and they were willing to be thrown in the fiery furnace. Daniel and his three friends, they were not wanting to eat the king's foods to violate their own conscience. And so I think there's just some great stories of faith that we can preach there. I think also we can begin to preach stories that God has a plan, and you know, we see in some of the books like Isaiah of this renewal of the heavens and earth, and we see a new kingdom. We see a one who is killed but raises again. And then Jeremiah and Ezekiel, we see judgment upon the nations, but that God somehow has a plan. Well, in Daniel, we begin to see that God is going to allow these nations to rise up, but that ultimately he's going to have a king. The Son of Man is going to rise up and is going to rule all. And so, you know, we can preach some things out of that. And so this is just an outline of the book of Daniel, and we'll leave that to you. I do want to highlight down here where it talks about Daniel's vision, the 70 weeks. You know, when they first went into captivity, they were told that they would be there for 70 years. And then Daniel receives this message that no, it's no longer going to be 70 years. You still haven't learned your lesson. And so captivity is going to last longer. And so he mentions the 70 weeks here in chapter 9. And so it's not an exact timeline, but it gives this picture and this idea that they will continue to be in captivity, which I think the captivity ends not when people start heading back to Jerusalem during Daniel's time or during the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, but eventually the captivity ends when Jesus dies on a cross, is resurrected, and then ascends to heaven to rule his kingdom now here on earth. And so I think that's where the focus is, and that eventually this is where the whole Bible story is heading. So that is a overview of these two wonderful books. And so some amazing things in the book. Just remember that God continues to use these in some great ways.